Alireza Firouzja's play in this game was positionally exquisite. He played it against Aryan Tari in Norway Chess 2021, and he had the black pieces, Tari had white, and he plays a really fighting Najdorf variation. So let's see what happened here, and if you love a daily chess video, do hit that subscribe button to never miss one. So the Najdorf starts with these opening moves. After the knight captures here, we had knight f6, knight c3, and pawn to a6 starts the Najdorf. So now there are many moves for white here. Tari goes with this sideline of pawn to a4, and he's starting this queenside expansion, clamping on b5, which black often plays, and we'll see that much of his play is now centered around that side of the board. So pawn to e5 from Firouzja, the classic Najdorf move, and it fits nicely with white playing like this. When you're getting attacked on the flank, it's often a good idea to play in the center. So the knight drops back. We had pawn to h6 now, a bit unusual. You'd often develop a piece there as black, say with bishop to e7, but this move does have some points. You control g5, of course, and importantly, you're playing against bishop g5, so that you can't have this knight chopped, and therefore you keep control of this d5 square. Now we had knight d2, and this is a strange looking move from Tari. So you block the d file here, you move the same piece for the third time in the opening, usually a no-no, but this is clearly some home preparation. Now d5 looks really logical here. If you can ever achieve this move in the Najdorf, you're usually doing quite well. You liberate that backwards pawn. But after captures here, knight captures, although it looks good for black visually, after this move bishop to c4, white's getting some really dynamic play here. So say you capture this knight on c3, you double the pawns, but white has this open b file to work with, and the bishop is developed here. Castles is coming very quickly, the e-pawn could be sensitive, clearly home preparation. Firouzja wanted no part of it. So instead of playing this pawn to d5 move, instead he just continues developing. Very sensible when your opponent springs an opening surprise. So now we had knight to c4, bringing another piece to the queen side, bishop to e7, and now knight d5 is a very interesting move. So it changes the pawn structure here after Firouzja captures that knight. The pawn recaptured, the bishop moved away. And there are themes of the Sveshnikov here, which we saw a lot between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana in their 2018 World Championship match. So we can see that black now has pawn breaks on the king side. That's where black will be playing. White, for his part, is coming on the queen side now, using this space here. So a very interesting and dynamic game, always fun to watch. a5 begins to clamp on this square where the knight often lands. Knight to d7 covers, bishop e2, castles from both players now, queen to c7 continues development, bishop to e3, and now bishop back to h7, making room for this pawn to come down the board. And now a really nice move from Tari, he goes rook to a3 here, and not only can this rook swing here or here later on to attack on the queen side, but it can also play a role actually in the centre of the board in some variations, coming to e3 here and looking down the e-file. Now it's quite deep stuff, but when black goes f5, which we'll see in a moment, so first we had rook a to c8, king to h1 prophylaxis, and now f5, white meets this with pawn to f4, and this is where at times the rook can swing, you see. Now pawn to f4 is important because you stop black from going pawn to f4, kicking your bishop and also liberating this piece, which could be a very bad bishop if black isn't careful. And now this is where Firouzja's positional judgment is just perfect. How would you respond here? Now, if you kick on with the pawn, this is bad. This bishop is completely dead for one thing, plus this knight is going to struggle to get into the game, as we can see. If you come to f6, there's not so many jumps. This square is well covered. So pawn e4 is bad. Well, what if you take the pawn? Also bad because now the bishop comes in, attacking here twice, and although you're defending that pawn with two pieces, it's vulnerable, it needs to be babysat now, so you can't move your bishop to this diagonal, and you can't kick this bishop with g5 or this is where the rook swing comes in. Rook e3. White is a lot better here because you can't move the bishop away or you drop here. So big problems for black there. So that's why instead Firouzja didn't push on, he didn't capture, he played bishop to f6, just waiting for white to play. Now he's quite happy with a capture here, it brings his pieces into the game. So now Tari looks to avoid that, he goes pawn to b4. A rook now came to the e-file, very logical. Queen d2 overprotects this square, rook e7. And this is the point, Firouzja is now preparing to double on the e-file with rooks, lots of pressure coming here. He forces this pawn grab by Tari, but this is exactly what he wants. And this is where the positional play is just beautiful in this game. So now the knight jumps in, look at the difference between the positions. And here Tari should take this knight. It's too dangerous to live with there. Say you had a line like this, pawn to c4, setting up the old bathtub here. And okay, it's a different game after rook fe8. But instead of this, Tari doesn't take that dangerous knight. He plays knight to b6. And it looks nice to jump it into this outpost. But the problem here is that you're just firing at thin air here, as we can see. It's not actually restricting the movement of the heavy pieces, so black can play around it. So now we had knight to g4, another excellent move from Firouzja. So he's very happy for this to be captured. It opens up this light squared bishop, black is much better. So that's why white seeks to avoid capturing this knight now, as we'll see. So bishop f4 was now played, Firouzja doubled his rooks on the e-file, we had bishop to f3 here, and now pawn to g5 comes, excellent move, Firouzja's never afraid to chuck a g-pawn, and here it's completely justified. You can't retreat the bishop with, say, bishop g3, or knight e3 is just devastating. Say you move the rook, well, pawn f4 comes, and now look at this piece in the game. So we didn't have this. Instead, white captured here, but after the pawn recaptured, look at these bishops just raking down the board. Huge problems now for white. So bishop e3 now came. Rook f7 holds this bishop, which was attacked. And it also starts to set up tactics now. We can see the back rank is a bit exposed for white. Pawn c4, we have the bathtub being set up again. And now if you want to pause the video here and look for the best move in the position, then please do so. There are two moves, both have a very similar idea, and they give black a big advantage. So Firouzja played bishop b2. You also could have gone to c3 there. And the whole idea here is that the rook is attacked, we're taken with check, so white takes here. The queen recaptures. Now if you move your rook anywhere, you're running into the same variations we saw in the game, except that you haven't won the bishop. So white takes the bishop, best move. Now we have this check, but it's not quite checkmate because the bishop drops back. But here's the point, you don't go rook e1, instead you go rook e2, threatening checkmate here with the queen, and hitting this one, so white is forced to give that up. The queen recaptures, and so white now has rook and bishop for queen, but in this position that's just not good because the king has issues here, it's exposed, and black has pawns which are coming down the board, bishop coming to e4 here, big problems. So rook e3 was played, the queen came to c2, an excellent move looking at these pawns, but more importantly supporting bishop e4 here, as we can see. So pawn c5 played, bishop e4, rook g3 protects the mate, Firouzja captures here, and now Tari plays pawn d6, but if he captures this one, well now h5 is a lovely move, and white's actually getting kind of zugzwanged here because you can't move this, you can't move the bishop, so you could play pawn d6, but now the king comes across the cover, d7, king e7. The knight basically doesn't have any moves here. You can start jumping here, but then you lose the pawn. The rook's trapped. If the bishop moves, we have problems. Awesome position for black, and h5 is coming soon. So instead, d6 was played, trying to get that passed pawn going quicker, but Firouzja simply captures here. The pawn kicked on, but queen d2 covers the queening square quite adequately. The rook takes on g4 now, hitting the bishop, so it drops back to c6. And now a nice interference move from Tari. He goes bishop d4, preparing to queen that pawn. So the bishop has to take now. The knight captures. Looks like you've won a clear piece, but there's still way too many problems on the back rank. This pawn is coming. Now don't go like this, queen d1 check, thinking, hey, I'm picking up the rook after bishop drops, queen takes rook, because then knight f6 check, you've just lost your queen in the game. So you always have to be aware of the tactics, even in winning positions. But pawn b3 was played. Great move. That passed pawn is going down the board, can't be stopped without giving up a piece. So pawn h3 was played, pawn b2, bishop captures, queen takes back, king h2, queen c3 now, rook g3 hits the queen took on a5 here, and after knight f6 check, king f7, the knight moved away, and we can see that white is just in tons of trouble. There's two connected passed pawns, and there's still lots of checks possible against the white king. So king g7 was played, holding the pawn. We had rook to d3, queen to c7 check, king h1, pawn a5, knight e3, and these are all just token moves really at this stage. These pawns are going to decide the day. So pawn a4, knight f5 check, king g6, pawn g4, and queen c1 check was the final move of the game. Way too many problems with the exposed king and the passed pawns. If you enjoyed this game and want to see another Firouzja Tari crush, then click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.